flat land. As they passed through tall grass, wild turkeys flew up around them, and small game scurried to either side. But the scouts' keen eyes were focused in the distance toward the buffalo wallow, in hopes that a migrating herd had returned. Within 100 years, the landmarks would all change. The big Osage War Trail would be dissected by numerous housing additions, from Broken Arrow through Bridle Trails, Sheridan Park, Stone Bridge, and Country Squire Estates. The river crossing would be marked by a power plant. The river would be interrupted by sandbars and dredging operations. What was once open space would be populated by a city of 8,000. Tank farms, old railroad lines, and abandoned oil wells would reflect the changing times. And the Buffalo Wallow would be dry land incorporated into the site of one of the entire area's major sources of pride, the Jenks Public School. From the beginning of the town's, the growth of the town and the growth of the school would be intertwined, held together by the values of the people who came to settle here, and this is their story. So we put it in the context. This area was settled by indigenous peoples. All of what is now Oklahoma, you would have had the Apache, the Arapaho, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Osage, the Wichita. Those were the native indigenous peoples to this area that lived here during the time when we think of European contact. So you can think back to your Oklahoma history, or your world history. In 1492, what happened? Columbus
sailed the ocean blue.
You guys still got it. I'm proud. Okay, so I'll tell your history teacher they should be proud. But the Spanish were the first Europeans to kind of make contact, and we don't know exactly who came to this area. Coronado definitely had part of his conquistador exploration. He's looking for the 7 cities of gold. He's wandering through the Panhandle area, so he had claimed this area for Spain. We have the French that are coming with Hernando Soto coming into Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. He claimed what was the Mississippi River area. One of the ones that's kind of important to us in this area is De La Harpe, Bernard de la Harpe, who came in 1719, and he came up the Mississippi River Valley, particularly the Red River and the Arkansas River. And in talking to Mr. Parker earlier, he said when they were doing excavations at the Kimberly-Clark site, when they were getting ready to build the plant there at Kimberly-Clark, there was actually artifacts that were found that quite possibly could be traced back to members of De La Harpe's exploration in 1719. The Louisiana Purchase made this part of the United States, except for the Panhandle. The rest of what is now Oklahoma was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. You guys remember Lewis and Clark starting out in St. Louis and heading west. And so at that time, American interest in what was west of the Mississippi really grew. And so there were several important expeditions that made its way through what was then going to be considered Indian Territory, now the present-day state of Oklahoma. You had Zebulon Pike in 1806, an Army captain who led an expedition, eventually went to Colorado, and what do we have now? Pikes Peak. You guys are sharp. I like it. All right, so in 1820, another American captain, Stephen Long, was participating in an expedition throughout the Great Plains area, and he wrote of this area as the Great American Desert. And the reason that's significant is what he meant was you could look out and see plains for miles and miles and miles, just waves of different grasslands and stuff. Some of you have been up to Pawhuska, to the Osage Tallgrass Prairie area, and how to restoring some of that to the native grasses. But that's what he meant by the Great American Desert. People read that and thought, well, that's no good. Who wants to go to a desert, right? So initially, some of the thought was that this part would be, they wouldn't have flyover states at that point, right? But it would be a part that you would move away from to get out to the West Coast, to get out to the Oregon country, to get out to later California, to the gold rush and that kind of thing. So this was kind of the part that early Americans were thinking was not going to be really inhabitable and economically an area to be developed. The reason this is significant is when we get to, you see the first part here, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So we have what we call the 5 tribes. At that time, they were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes in the southeastern part of the United States. Remember from in history, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, as the Americans referred to them, the Muskogee Nation as they referred to themselves, the Muskogee peoples, and then the Seminole. So these were tribes that were in the southeastern part of the United States. They integrated. They were picking up economic developments. Many of those tribes had forms of government, including a written constitution, 3 branches of government, very similar to the American system. But it impeded what was considered to be progress. And so there was a desire to move them from that area, the southeastern part of the United States, into an area that would be reserved for Indian territory. And so Indian removal began in 1830. As far as it relates to us in this area, we have the first settlement around the Council Oak tree, which is about 18th and Boulder. If you guys have been down there, right off of Riverside. So that was 1836. So that's going to begin the inhabitants of this area by the Muskogee Nation, the Muskogee peoples. And the name Tulsa was a derivation of Tulasi, which meant the old town. So they actually took the campfires from their old town and brought them the ashes and brought them and reignited them here in this area, right? This is going to be significant for a family we're going to talk about in a little bit that's really important in Jenks history, the Perryman family. But then you'll see some other things here. The Civil War is going to come into play. Jenks is going to be formed in 1905, and then some other things that we'll talk about as well. So this is just something that talks about what's called the Council Oak tree there. And again, that was the ceremonial start and the founding of the Muskogee Nation resettling in this area. Eventually, their capital would be moved to Omogi. So from the 1830s, 1840s, up until the Civil War, this is what Indian Territory looked like. So the the Muskogee Creek Nation was the area between the Cimarron River and the Arkansas River, basically from what was then Arkansas Territory all the way out to Texas. Texas during this period belonged to Spain, and after the Mexican Revolution belonged to Mexico, and then we know about the Alamo and the Texas fight for their war for independence. You see the little gray area down there. That was an area that was disputed by several different treaties because that's the northern branch of the Red River. So Texas claimed that part of what is now Oklahoma. Eventually that would have to be settled to be the south bank of the Red River, and that's why we ended up with the state boundaries that we have today. So this is what Indian Territory looked like prior to the Civil War. But the Civil War divided Indian Territory into 5 tribes, much like it divided the North and the West, the North and the South, excuse me. So there were many tribes who, and even in this area, were slave owners. They had plantations, they grew cotton, and their economy was based upon slave labor. We know that the Muskogee Creek members brought slaves into this area, referred to as freedmen. We know the Cherokee had freedmen. So slavery was not, it was a practice in Indian Territory. So during the Civil War, really the federal troops, the Union troops, basically fled and left Indian Territory to fend for itself. So there were tribes that their old divisions reignited. And for example, the Cherokee, there was a gentleman, Stan Wadey. He became a brigadier general. He was the leader of the Cherokee Mounted Rifles. And so he had not only some of the Cherokee, but other Indian regiments under his command. In fact, we know that General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. Stan Wadey was actually the last Confederate general to surrender during the Civil War. But this area, there were still people that were trying to stay loyal to the Union, to the North government. But unfortunately, the Army protection had abandoned them. So both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, saw Indian Territory as a prime source of grain, of agricultural products. And both of them wanted control of Indian Territory. And once the federal troops abandoned this area, there were some Creeks. The leader of the Creeks that stayed loyal to the Union government was Apopoli Yahola. And you can go to North Tulsa and up by Sperry, and you can see some running battles there's still some historical markers that note some running battles that Apophalia had with Confederate forces as he eventually had to retreat up into Kansas for the duration of the war. But as a result, what happened during the Civil War is, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, since there were elements of the 5 tribes that fought for the Confederacy, the government voided all of the treaties that had taken place to give them Indian territory. And so basically, you see here that they were expanded across the east to the west part of the state. But after the Civil War, they're going to be all crammed together into just this eastern part of what's now, these were 2 territories. So this was considered Indian territory, and then this was Oklahoma territory. And even in Oklahoma territory, this is the period of time in American history, the Indian Wars, when you had other tribes from other parts of the United States being pushed into Oklahoma. Whether it's Geronimo and the Apache, you had, Custer pursuing the Sioux up at Little Bighorn. So you had several tribes, even from the western part and the southwestern part of the United States, being relocated here. But in 1905, this is all of the 5 tribes. So in 1905, these tribal leaders got together and held a convention in Muskogee. And they actually petitioned the U.S. Congress to become a state that was going to be an all Indian nation state. And they were going to call themselves the state of Sequoia. Theodore Roosevelt was the president at the time. He and Congress were not very amenable to having a state made up entirely of native populations. And so their request, their petition, which included the Constitution with 3 branches of government, a state legislature, and all those things, was not accepted. And so eventually in 1906, the Enabling Act joined Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory together, and Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And so we'll talk about why that's significant, particularly for this area. There's 2 big pieces of legislation that affected this part of Oklahoma. The Dawes Commission in 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Severalty Act took all these tribal lands and moved tribal lands that were held communally into individual allotments. And then the Dawes Commission in 1893 was headed by U.S. Senator Henry Dawes from Massachusetts. And so the early Dawes Severalty Act didn't apply to the 5 tribes. So in 1893, the Dawes Commission took the 5 tribes and negotiated settlements so that each of these tribes would give up their communal properties and hand out individual allotments. So this is significant for this area, particularly as we talk about the Perryman homestead, the Perryman ranch, because that was an amalgamation of 3 different freedmen allotments that were joined together. Interestingly enough, Senator Dawes died a couple of years, 1903. His second in command, the person that took over that work for that commission, was Tams Bixby. I wonder if that sounds important, right? So I wonder where we've heard that name before. All right. So moving along here. So when we look at this area, we mentioned the Perryman Ranch, and the Perryman Ranch and the Perryman family were very, very important to this area. The Perrymans eventually established the first post office in Tulsa. The Perryman Ranch, pre-Dawes period, really expanded from Midtown up around 31st and Utica, all the way over to the river, down south as far as Duck Creek and Ogogie area, as far east as Muskogee. And there were these huge open ranges. And the reason this is significant is because this is also the time period in the 1880s of the cattle drives, right? And so drivers would be having their cattle in Texas and trying to get them to railheads in Kansas to ship back east or to Chicago for meatpacking plants. And so as they drove their herds, they needed places to graze, right? And so the Perryman Ranch was this huge expanse where the Muskogee Nation, the Muskogee tribe, got thousands and thousands of dollars in revenue from grazing rights as these Texas drovers would send their cattle up the trail and get them to railheads. But they had over 10,000 acres. This is a picture of what was eventually the homestead at 115th and Elwood. This is what the original house began to look like up around 32nd and Utica. And they had a wraparound porch, and in the back room, one of the Perryman brothers set up a couple of cubicles and some mail slots, and that was Tulsa's first post office. And there's still a little sign if you go to 36th and Utica today, just on the north side of the road, there's a little sign that says site of Tulsa's first post office. But that was the Perryman family who ran that. This is the Perryman Cemetery. I don't know if you guys have been by it. It's at 32nd in Utica. But it started as the Perryman Family Cemetery. The Tulsa Historical Society, took that over as a responsibility to try to keep that up. But for our part of the story, the Perrymans, after allotment, their homestead became just where the Perryman Ranch was at 115th and Elwood. That was 3 members of the family, putting their allotments together and having their homesteads there. So how did this part of, the Muskogee Nation really start to develop? What was a big driver? Well, it was the Midland Valley Railroad Company. And this was not uncommon for most towns, agricultural towns that developed during this period of time. So again, I said my family was from Moore. And we'll talk about and maybe have to argue about how Jenks got its name, because there's a little controversy there. We'll explore that in a minute. But it's not uncommon. So my great-grandparents had a farm just right off the railroad line there in Moore. And the story in Moore was that the train kept going from Oklahoma City to Norman, and there was a gentleman who lived there who worked for the railroad that got tired of the train passing by and not dropping off his mail, and him have to go into Norman to get his mail. So he put up a board with the name Moore on it, wanting the railroad, the mail train to stop and deliver his mail before it went on to Norman. And so from him hanging out his name post, Moore, that's how Moore supposedly got its name. Some people say similar story for Jenks, but it wasn't uncommon for those types of things to happen because communities were agricultural in nature and they were really tied to the railroad. And so for this community, the story is the Midland Valley Railroad Company. It was founded in 1903 there. It was working to bring goods basically from Fort Smith to up into Kansas. So there's evidence that originally it was going towards Tulsa, that it was expanding from Fort Smith to Muskogee, then on to Tulsa, and it was going to make its way up towards Pawhuska. And there was talk that the Midland Valley Railroad Company was going to go through Sapulpa, was going to build their line basically from Muskogee to Sapulpa. But some Jenks residents saw the value of having the railroad come through their community and convinced the railroad executives that it would be cheaper and more economically beneficial for them to build it through Jenks rather than through Sapulpa. So I guess we got one over on them. All right, but that's kind of how it happened. Of course, we're going to find that the discovery of oil in this area facilitates. They complement each other. The railroad needs the oil company for revenue and for shipping, and the community needs the oil that also relies upon the railroad company. But the Midland Valley Railroad Company was completed in 1906 with a branch that went eventually down to Kiefer, mainly because of the Glenpool. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it closed in 1968 as many different railroad companies started to be bought out and purchased by others and stuff like that. So in 1907, you got the company was connecting a rail line to Tulsa and the Arkansas River Valley. It really expanded down to Midland, Texas and Kansas City. So you see it had a vast reach in the area. In the 1920s, because of agricultural produce and also because of the oil boom in the 1920s, it really did experience a lot of growth and economic development. and then even used in the 1940s as a result of producing and shipping war materials during World War II. So this is an early picture. This is from the website. If you haven't checked out the website, you ought to check it out. If you've contributed photos to the website, thank you for doing that. That's really great. And we need to get these digitized and on the website and taken care of before we lose them, right? So encourage those of you that are doing that. This is a picture of the first depot. The depot was eventually a two-story structure. It was the first structure built in town. The bottom floor served as the depot. The second floor served as the station master's quarters. And so these are some pictures from the early days of the Midland Valley here in Jenks. I do want to mention, so a couple of things. So Jenks, the town, we talked about the name, okay? So you guys can tell me I'm wrong as I'm walking out the door today. I don't want to start a fight. We'll get to the first fight. The first fight is from a baseball game between Jenks and Bixby. We'll talk about that in a second too. But so there's different ideas about the name Jenks. Where does the town get its name? Okay. So according to the Oklahoma Place Names book, anthology that's been written, Jenks was named for Elmer E. Jenks, who was a longtime local resident. I think, Wayne, you said he was a railroad?
He was a postmaster.
Okay, postmaster, okay? Now, the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History, which is run by the Oklahoma Historical Society, quotes a 1957 Tulsa Tribune article that says J.H. Hill was a local agent for the Townsite Company, the Midland Valley Townsite Company, and he said the Jenks, whose name was given to the town, was a director in the Philadelphia headquarters of the railroad company. And the Philadelphia office said, hey, you ought to name a town after, this executive up here in Philadelphia. And his name was William Henry Jenks. So according to the Tulsa Tribune in 1957, they say it's named after a railroad executive, the Midland Valley Railroad. So again, I'm sure people in here have different ideas and thoughts, but it actually does list both stories in this book about how the town got its name. But it would not have been uncommon for a postmaster or employee of the railroad to put a shingle out that says, hey, this is the town side of Jenks. We want to make sure you get a mail stop. Something else that Mr. Parker has pointed out, if you look, it's not uncommon for depots to be about every 10 miles down the line, okay? So this would be 10 miles from the Tulsa line, and so that would be a very common place where they would stop and take on, water and coal and that kind of thing. So it was not uncommon for communities to be spaced about 10 miles apart, and this seems to be another example that could kind of fit that pattern. The Glen oil pool was huge. So in 1901, there was oil discovered in the Red Fork area, okay? And once oil was discovered in that area, it just blew up. And all your Wild West movies where you saw, the outlaws and the cowboys and the shoot-'em-ups and all that stuff, that became a wildcatter town in Red Fork. And a lot of you guys have probably been over there on Route 66 and seen the railroad area there. But it was very chaotic. It was very dangerous. It was very disorganized. It was very cutthroat and competitive. And so at Glenpool, the discovery of oil came in 1905, but they really sat on it and kept it quiet until they could get the infrastructure and they could get their buddies in on the deal for the investment. They didn't want to let the secret out, right? Kind of like in California, the gold boom, the 49ers showed up in 1849, but gold was first discovered in 1848. They tried to sit on it for a while, but you can't sit on the secret, right? Eventually it's going to get out. So by 1906, the Glen oil pool started to develop. Why is that important? Because that was just an economic boom here. So as workers were needed to work the Glen oil pool, they needed a place to stay, right? So you had tent cities and tent communities for workers set up all the way up here into Jenks. This is actually a 1911 Tulsa World advertisement where the Jenks founders are saying, hey, come to Jenks, all right? you can get rich. You can buy a chance to invest in an area that may make you a rich oil man, all right, oil baron. So, and when you look at the early development of this area, you know, the oil stations and the oil wells were important. Even on the Perryman Ranch, there were oil wells that were found there as well. So oil is a big part of this community story, particularly after the Glen Pool was discovered and more workers were needed. Of course, in the 1920s, Tulsa was considered to be the oil capital of the world. So oil is very important to the development of this area. In its early days, agriculture and oil, along with the railroad, facilitated by the railroad, are really the important aspects. Like I said, in 1907, Oklahoma becomes a state. That's the first full census that's done in Jenks at the time of statehood. And the time of state, how big do you think Jenks was at the time of statehood? What do you think?
307.
307. I like that. Miss Grable says it with confidence. Any other guesses?
306.
306. Jonathan's is not the price of right.
2000.
2000. It was 465 at the time of and of course, most of those come from allotments, right? Those were a lot of the early residents were people who had allotted. And I'm pretty sure, well, I think it's one of Wayne's posts, one of his blog posts, if you haven't checked out the different blog posts on the museum website, I think Wayne gives a post there on the people who had the first allotments that were some of the, at the time of statehood.
We have a descendant of one of those allotments here, Marilyn Ishmael is here today. She's over here.
All right. Great.
There may be others, I don't know.
All right.
Her family was an original allottee here.
See, that's why you guys make me nervous. You guys have the family lore, right? So that's wonderful. Of course, you know, what got Jenks going, what got Jenks moving. You know, the Perryman Ranch was important for the economic development. Agriculture was important to the economic development. The oil field was important to the economic development. And all that stuff boosted property values and Jenks schools. And so the Jenks schools is a huge part, because if you go back, and I've looked at Board of Education minutes, I was really bored, wasn't I? I looked at Board of Education minutes from the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, and you can see the pride that people have. And I'll just say this, school boards are very important. Volunteer positions. These people give their time. There's no payment for that. I love our school board, and I appreciate them. But you can see the school boards, even in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, really committing to what's going to build the future of this community. We know flooding is a part. We'll get to some slides here. But this is a picture. I think this is on their website, but I think this came out of the Hickory Stick book, working on the blackboard in 1908. You guys have probably seen the pillar on Main Street that's there over by the antique, across from KFC. Poor KFC, I'm so sad. Across from KFC, you have the posts from the original schoolhouse that was built. This was the two-story schoolhouse that was built. I don't know if you have noticed this, but our Education Service Center, just across from the Allen Trumbull Stadium, it has this motif with this middle column of the bell tower. So it tried to incorporate that past tradition of excellence that we have here in the community, and the tie between Jenks Public Schools and the community. So speaking of one of the serious things, the flooding, I read in the Tune of the Hickory Stick that flooding was so bad. I don't remember if it was 1908 or a different flood, that the flooding actually got to the second floor of the schoolhouse. And so I'm sure that was not good to clean up. But here's some pictures of flooding Polecat Creek in 1908, as well as 1940s. Of course, we know that that the Army Corps of Engineers came in and built a built a levee system around 1948 to kind of help with that. Bridges were important. You know, the first bridge across the Arkansas River was built in 1910. and then what we call the pedestrian bridge now was a bridge that was built in 1948. When I first got here at Jenks, I started teaching at Jenks East Middle School. I messed that place up so bad, that place doesn't even exist anymore. There's not a Jenks East Middle School anymore, right? Back then, there were two middle schools, one on the east side, one on the central campus. It is now Jenks East Intermediate, but I remember having to come across the bridge to go to the athletic department and things like that. I also coached football, and I can remember one night Tag Gross, our offensive coordinator, was actually in a wreck on the bridge before the game, and we thought we were going to have to start the game without him. Coach Trimble was an old offensive coordinator, so I think he was probably excited to think he was going to get to call plays that night, but Coach Gross eventually made it to the game. You guys remember what traffic was like on that old two-lane bridge, right?
Yep.
So just a couple of other things. Like I mentioned, one thing that I find fascinating, and I'm sure there are people in here, and I really appreciate the fact that you guys are going to have some more meetings and explore some different topics. But after World War I, agricultural prices shot up in the U.S., particularly in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was very economically affluent right after World War I, particularly because of all the grain, all the wheat that was being produced and sold to European countries. Herbert Hoover first got his work in government before he became president, working on food relief, on economic development and food relief for European countries that were torn up as a result of World War I. And so Oklahoma sent a lot of grain, a lot of agricultural products to Europe after World War I. And an interesting fact that I found, and I haven't been able to understand all the ins and outs of this or the whys and hows, but evidently there were immigrant families from Bulgaria and other parts of Eastern Europe that came to this community in the 1920s and after World War I that really started adding to the agricultural component and producing vegetables and things like that were eventually sold. Of course, as we go on, we know other things that were big in the development and leading to where we are today. You know, the opening of the Robert Jones Airport in 1958, the the PSO plant in the 1970s, and the Kimberly-Clark plant in the 1980s. And that fast forwards a lot into kind of where we are today. But I just wanted to kind of situate the Jenks story and the overall story of how it's so similar to many other communities that developed in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And the pride that people had, not because they knew what Jenks was going to be in 2025, but because they were working hard for their families and they were building on the future and they invested in schools and they invested in kids. And by doing that, you know, a thriving community developed. And it's one that we should take pride in, and one that we should learn the story of and share it and tell it often. So that's kind of what I have to share about, you know, situating it in the larger context of other events in America and Oklahoma. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I'll be glad to field any questions that you have, because if I don't know, I know who to deflect the questions to. What questions can I answer for you? Yes, Jonathan, of course.
Who was the best dancer that came out of Jenks?
The best dancer to come out of Jenks. Well, you know, we have a ballet dancer that went on to be Miss America, Jennifer Berry. So you got to give credit to Miss America, right? So, yes, sir.
Where does the term Jenks America come from?
I don't know all the ins and outs of that. Thanks for stumping me, Kevin. I appreciate that. And I'm sure people in here kind of know some of the background on that. But I know that also, from what I've read and heard, that has also been controversial at times, whether it should be called Jenks America or not be called Jenks America. So maybe that's a whole separate topic in and of itself. But I also know there was some conversation with Oral Roberts in the 1970s about changing the name, right?
Right.
Yep.
Yes.
What was that going to be?
Riverside.
Riverside, yeah.
Oral Roberts was trying to get his hospital established, the City of Faith, and he was having trouble with the City of Tulsa getting permits. And he had the idea that maybe Jenks, if he got Jenks to annex the City of Faith grounds, Oral Roberts University, that he would have a better chance of getting his hospital approved. So he rounded up the superintendent, the mayor, and other leading citizens in Jenks and had a meeting here in Jenks. I believe it's Jenks Restaurant.
Yeah.
And he said Jenks, trying to get Jenks to annex this Oral Roberts, said Jenks is a nice town, but it needs to upgrade its image. And
Sure that went over well.
yes, he suggested Jenks change its name to Riverside. And of course, people in Jenks are pretty proud of Jenks.
Yep.
It's Jenks, not Jins, but there were some people that printed up bumper stickers, and on it was the prayer tower and the words Jenks University. ORU.
Oh, wow. I bet he didn't like that one either. So it's interesting you bring that up. I don't know how many of you guys know Don King. I would really, really recommend that you have Don King in here for a session. He can do a fantastic history that integrates not just Jenks Trojan football, but also the community and things like that. But you know, it's often that he has the history that he brings into our broadcast, and I help with the broadcast, the radio broadcast. But you know, he says that there was a time where they were referred to as the River City
River Rats.
Yeah. So
That was actually Bixby was the River Rat.
So, now the story about the fight. So one of the first events was there was a baseball game that was supposed to take place between Jenks and Bixby. I think this is about 1906, just right after the city was founded, and it was actually going to be kind of an economic development time. People were going to come to town and talk about economic development. There was going to be a baseball game that was played, and so Jenks didn't even really have a team yet. There were a lot of local towns that had a team. My great grandfather played on a team in Moore with a guy that went on to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Pepper Martin. But so there are a lot of communities that had little town baseball teams, and so at this town baseball game between Jenks and Bixby, somebody made a $2 bet, and more important than that, somebody brought a lot of liquor and snuck it in, right? So there was a little bit of playing baseball, and there was a lot of drinking, and then there was an argument, and there was a $2 bet, and then, you know, the way the story is told, there's a city brawl between, you know, all the people that came from Bixby to watch the game and all the people that were there from Jenks. So that might have been the first big battle between Jenks and Bixby. So, yes, ma'am.
On the Jenks America, when we were kids, you crossed the Old River Bridge, and on the fence line, right at the end there, was a big sign that Thurman Cross had put up that said Jenks America.
Yeah. I remember Mike Babb talking about that concept, and when he first moved to the community, you know, there was very much in the Jenks schools, there was very much a mindset of the people from the west side of the river, the people from the town of Jenks, and the people from the east side of the river, right? So I remember Mike Babb telling a similar story about that sign. So.
Well, what he wanted was, on his TV show and all, he wanted to get his mail in Riverside, Oklahoma, and that was kind of a romantic name, and so that was behind the whole thing, or at least partly behind it, was to change the name to Riverside so that people could just send in their mail, their money, like my mother, to Riverside, Oklahoma, or just Riverside, America.
Got it. All right.
You've done a fantastic job. There's so much to know about stories. I would like to interject one thing, and it was curious to me how the actual land was transferred from the Muskogee tribe to what became the town site of Jenks. And that happened, a guy by the name of Cravens bought about 130 to 150 acres from the original town site, to make the original town site in 1905. He bought it from 3 Freedman Creek allottees for $1,000. And then 3 days later, he sold it for $1,600 to the Midland Valley Townsite Company. You think he had advance warning of what was going on? $600 in 3 days back then was a huge profit.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how the actual allottees transferred it to the original town site of Jenks, which we're setting basically on the northwest corner of the original town site, which ran from right here to the river and from B Street, which we're setting on, over to what's now, I guess, it's Beaver Street. Back then it was A Street and A Avenue and B Street and B Avenue. But it was just a very small area. And it points back to the original census in 1907. That was just counting, I'm assuming, the city limits of Jenks. But the area must have been pretty big in population when Glenpool was really underway, because they had literally thousands of oil derricks put up back in the day. And people, like you said, tent city, and they were not counted in the original Jenks town site census. So the area must have been pretty big.
And of course, there were lots of communities that were spread out in the area beyond just this regular original platted town site, right? So over where Jenks East Elementary is, that was part of a community called Renty Grove, and that was part of a former freedman community, so an African-American community. You can still see there's a church up, a white building. It used to be one of the original churches for that community, up towards 81st.
In the cemetery.
Cemetery there. Some have been renamed, was Booker T. Washington Cemetery. I think they renamed it to Oak Crest or something like that. But, so there were several communities in what is now what we consider to be the Jenks Public School District, as well as, again, looking at those board minutes, the Jenks Public Schools paid for the salaries for it was a segregated school, so it was an all-black school, but they paid for the salaries for the teachers and supplies for that school there at Renty Grove. So, yes, sir.
The board, your timeline had the consolidation of other school districts into Jenks. Do you know what other school districts were consolidated?
Well, I know Renty Grove was one of those.
There was Pogue.
Yes. So what is, there were several community schools, and the Pogue was an oil company school that was started out in the rural area. And that's not where the fire station is, right? The Pogue school is a different place.
It was at 111th and Elwood, a mile south.
Yeah.
It stood for Prairie Oil and Gas Company.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there was also a Golden Rule School, which was up by about somewhere close to 71st and Lewis. That was integrated. There was a Covey School up by the airport. And I think there was one other, I can't remember right now.
If you're interested, we do have Dr. Jeff Byer, who is part of our administrative team at Jenks. He has a great outline of the history of Jenks schools, so he'd be somebody to contact. But again, I think it's very exciting to see this turnout. I think it's very exciting to have a local museum. When you look around Sand Springs, Glenpool, Bixby, other communities have one. So I'm really excited, and I'm honored to be here. I hope I've made your time beneficial in some way, and done this task justice. I'll be happy to come back and talk about other things from time to time. But I just appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your investment in this community, and I appreciate especially those of you who have gone before to help somebody like me come in, even in the 90s, and make a place for my home. I still think of myself as being from Moore. I don't know why, because I haven't been there since 1993. So I've lived most of my life in this community, but this community has blessed me and my family. Like we said, we have 3 kids that have come through Jenks, and have a granddaughter who lives in this area. And so just really thrilled to be here and be part of this very special event today. So thank you guys for having me. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.